In the winter of 1876, a widow stepped into the Black Pine Company office with her son's hand in one fist and a stone warm as bread hidden in her pocket. Outside, the pump handle had frozen before sunset. Inside, Gideon Vale told her she was dangerous. He sat beneath a map of the valley he owned, with a brass scale in his hand and a coal stove glowing behind him. He had the look of a man who believed the weather needed his permission before it changed. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, "winter comes when winter comes, not when a frightened woman decides it has already arrived." Eliza Harrow did not raise her voice. She opened her little ledger on his desk. In it were dates, temperatures, hoof prints, bird movements, bark splits, creek ice, moon rings, and the slow math of a season turning cruel.
"The cranes left 11 days early," she said.
"The marmots have sealed their holes with stone. The creek froze from the bottom in October. The cattle are growing winter coat on the belly first. That means the cold will sit low and stay there." Gideon smiled at the men gathered behind her. The smile was the verdict. Her 8-year-old son, Caleb, pressed his face against her sleeve. In her pocket, Eliza's fingers closed around the little brown stone she had found near the North Ravine 3 weeks before. Every other rock in the valley bit the skin with cold. This one held warmth. She could not explain it yet, but she trusted it more than she trusted the room. By sunset, Gideon Vale gave her 1 hour to leave Black Pine Crossing. Not for stealing, not for breaking a law,
Not even for shouting.
for noticing. Eliza had not come west to be the woman people crossed the street to avoid. She had come with her husband, Nathan, when Black Pine was still a scatter of tents beside a silver claim. Nathan believed the mountain would pay for a real house, a milk cow, and a schoolbook for Caleb with his own name written inside the cover. The mountain paid in another currency. A cracked beam, a lantern going out, 6 men buried under gray shale before supper. After the cave-in, Black Pine did what towns like that called kindness. Eliza was allowed to sleep in the lean-to behind the assay shed if she washed ore dust out of miners' shirts and patched knees until her fingers bled. Men nodded to Nathan's widow when they wanted to feel generous. Their wives sent broth when it cost them nothing, but grief had taken everything from Eliza, except attention. So she used attention like a tool. She watched frost settle heavier on the low meadows than the ridges. She watched the willows turn brittle while their leaves were still green. She watched field mice move seed heads uphill, not downhill, and she wrote it down beside old weather tables copied from a farmer's circular Nathan had carried in his trunk. At first, people laughed gently. Then they laughed less gently, because her notes kept troubling the story the town needed to believe. Black Pine Crossing lived on credit from Gideon Vale's company store. If miners left early for winter work, Gideon lost money. If farmers cut hay before he gave the word, he lost money. If families bought extra flour before prices rose, Gideon lost money. So Gideon preached patience. Reverend Pike gave the patience a holy name. "Fear is a poor lantern," the Reverend told the congregation. "God has ordered the seasons. We honor him by trusting the order." Eliza heard the sermon from the back wall, with laundry soap still burning her hands. Afterward, Reverend Pike placed a soft hand on her shoulder. "Your mind has been wounded," he said. "Let it heal before you lead others into alarm." He meant it as mercy. It landed as a lock being turned. By late October, Eliza had stopped asking questions and started warning people plainly. Bring the goats down, roof the hay, cut what is left in the fields now. Move the children away from the draft walls. The first storm will not be the worst one. Her proof was not dramatic. That was part of the problem. No angel had appeared, no sky had cracked open. She had a ledger full of small things that only became frightening when placed together. Geese gone before the fair, ice pearls under river stones, mold on the north side of fence posts, deer bedding near town in daylight, a halo around the moon for 5 nights running. At the November meeting, she stood in the schoolhouse and read the list. When she finished, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then Gideon Vale laughed once. Not loudly. Loud would have made him seem angry. He laughed like a man correcting a child. Mrs. Harrow has mistaken loneliness for science, he said, and sorrow for prophecy. Some men chuckled. A few women looked down. Reverend Pike closed his eyes, as if praying for her humility. 3 bright days followed. That was all Gideon needed. The sky cleared until it was blue as enamel. The wind softened. Men walked without coats at noon and pointed at the sun as if it were a witness for the prosecution. By the 3rd afternoon, Gideon posted a notice on the company door. Eliza Harrow was spreading panic against the common good. She was to leave by sundown. The town gave her a mercy of 1 sack. She packed Nathan's weather circular, her ledger, a twist of saved seeds in oilcloth, a flint striker, Caleb's spare stockings, no flour, no blanket worth naming. Gideon's clerk watched from the doorway to make sure she did not take anything that belonged to the company, which meant nearly everything around her. Nathan's field journal was still in the trunk under her cot. The clerk took the trunk key. Eliza looked at him, then at Caleb. She chose the child. They walked north because north was where the stone had come from. At first the road seemed almost kind. Frost silvered the grass. The sky held its cold blue shine. Black pine shrank behind them, its chimneys smoking like little signatures of life. Then the road ended. The deer track beyond it angled into broken country, past scrub pine and black cliffs where the wind came through narrow cuts with a sound like teeth filing bone. Caleb tried not to cry. Eliza knew this because he kept swallowing the cries before they reached his mouth. She told him to count steps. "Only to 20, she said. "Then we begin again." They counted to 20 across frozen mud, to 20 across shale, to 20 through a patch of thorn that tore her skirt and opened a red line on his cheek. By dark, they found a hollow under a fallen cedar. It stopped the wind from one direction and invited it from 2 others. Eliza scraped needles into a bed, wrapped Caleb against her chest, and pressed the warm stone between both their palms. He whispered, "Is it magic?" "No," she said, but after a long moment she added, "Magic is what people call a thing before they learn how it works." That night, the cold did not feel like weather. It felt like an animal testing them. It entered through the seams of her dress. It crawled under her nails. It found the space between mother and child, no matter how tightly she held him. Caleb shivered so hard his teeth clicked. Eliza stayed awake counting the clicks. As long as he shivered, he was fighting. Near dawn, his coughing began. On the 2nd day, the land lost its edges. Snow dust moved over the ground without falling from the sky, lifted and thrown by wind that never seemed to breathe in. Eliza's feet went numb before noon. Her left thumb turned the color of candle wax. They found water under ice at the bend of a creek. She broke it with a stone until her wrist shook. The water was so cold it hurt more than thirst, but she made Caleb drink first. He leaned against her afterward, too tired to stand straight. The sensible part of her mind began building a case for surrender. Go back, kneel if you must. Let Gideon win. Let the Reverend call it repentance. Let the town give Caleb a corner near the stove. A living child was worth any humiliation. By dusk, she had almost obeyed that voice. Then her hand brushed the warm stone. It was still warm, not the fading heat of a pocketed object, not the memory of skin. The stone had warmth of its own, steady and quiet, as if somewhere beneath the frozen ground a hidden heart was beating. Eliza stopped walking. Caleb stumbled into her skirts. She turned toward the ridge where she had found it, not because hope returned, because the problem had returned. Warmth had a source. Find the source. That was all. The next morning, she did not tell Caleb they were saved. She did not know that. She told him they were going to solve the stone. They climbed toward the north ravine in a silence made of pain. The pines grew older there, twisted and low, their trunks bent by years of weather. A fox track crossed the snow and vanished between two slabs of limestone. Above it, the air trembled. Eliza blinked. A thread of vapor rose from the rock and disappeared. It was so faint that a confident person would have missed it. Eliza was not confident. She was attentive. She pushed through a curtain of frozen roots and found an opening behind them, narrow enough that she had to turn sideways. Warm mineral breath touched her face. Caleb made one small sound. Not joy. Recognition. Inside, the wind stopped. That was the first miracle, though Eliza would never use the word. The passage sloped into darkness. She struck the flint, caught a spark in cedar fluff, and lifted a little flame. The walls were pale limestone, streaked with rust. Drops of water gathered and fell from the ceiling in patient intervals. 20 steps in, the air changed again. It did not become summer, it became possible. On the left wall, a seam of dark stone cut through the limestone like a vein. Eliza placed her palm against it and felt the same warmth she had felt in the pebble. Below the seam, water moved out of the rock in a thin, clear runnel and collected in a basin shaped by time rather than hands. No ice, no wind. Water, warmth, stone, shelter. The world had answered in a language too quiet for Black Pine to hear. Eliza lowered Caleb beside the basin and gave him water by the handful. His face, gray with cold an hour before, softened in the still air. Only then did she sit down. She did not cry. Crying belonged to people who had reached an ending. Eliza had reached work. The first fire nearly killed them with smoke. The cave gave warmth, but not flame, and flame was the difference between hiding and living. Eliza found a crack in the ceiling near the entrance, where cold air pulled upward. Beneath it, she and Caleb built a ring from broken limestone. She sealed the gaps with wet clay. The second fire smoked less. The third breathed. When the smoke drew cleanly into the crack, Eliza laughed once. It frightened Caleb, because he had not heard that sound from her since his father died. They made rules. Water first, firewood before dark. No step outside without telling the other. Everything useful is kept. Everything strange is studied. She made a knife from a shard of broken slate and wrapped the dull end in strips of her skirt. It cut badly, which was better than not cutting. She stripped bark, trimmed roots, scraped hides from carcasses foxes had abandoned, and taught Caleb how to twist cedar fiber into cord. Hunger turned them practical. A snare caught nothing the first night, nothing the second. On the third, it held a snowshoe hare by one hind leg. Caleb looked away while Eliza ended it. She made him look back when the meat went into the pot. "Thank it," she said, "then waste none of it." They ate slowly beside the fire, the cave walls breathing mineral heat behind them. But meat would not be enough. The valley might have dismissed Eliza's ledger, but the ledger had trained her to think in systems. Shelter without food was delay. Food without renewal was a countdown. The warm seam had not merely saved them from freezing, it had given them a season hidden inside another season. At the back of the cave, where the warm stone ran closest to the floor, the soil stayed damp and loose. Eliza dug into it with a rib bone and the slate knife. The earth smelled black and alive. She cleared a bed no longer than a wagon, no wider than a door. From the oilcloth twist, she poured the seeds into her palm. Turnip, cress, onion, winter cabbage, a few beans Nathan had saved because he liked the red speckle on their skins. Caleb watched as if she were burying treasure. She pressed each seed into the dark. Then came the harder question. Light. The cave mouth faced north, and winter sunlight barely entered. For 3 days, Eliza watched the pale strip that appeared near noon and died before it reached the garden bed. She moved stones, she scraped soot from the wall, she cursed softly and apologized to no one. The answer came from an old assay dump half buried outside the ravine. Not gold, not silver, waste. A warped sheet of tin, 2 cracked lamp reflectors, flakes of white crystal that split into thin plates when tapped with the slate knife. Gideon's town had thrown away everything that did not fit its idea of value. Eliza carried the scraps home like holy objects. She set tin and crystal in clay at different angles near the entrance. The first arrangement scattered light across the ceiling. The second blinded her. The third sent one weak blade of sun onto the soil. She adjusted the pieces for days. Inch by inch, noon by noon, she taught the winter sun to turn corners. The first green shoot appeared during a storm that buried the ravine mouth to the height of Caleb's chest. It was a cress sprout, pale and thin, almost embarrassed by its own existence. Eliza knelt so close her breath trembled over it. Caleb whispered, "It worked." "No," Eliza said, "it is working." That distinction mattered. For the rest of December, Black Pine Crossing vanished behind weather. Snow fell, hardened, fell again. The trail disappeared. Trees cracked at night with pistol-shot sounds. Inside the cave, the fire burned small and steady. Water ran. The warm seam held. The garden grew in a light made of stolen angles. By New Year's week, they had cress enough to cut with a thread, turnip greens as broad as spoons, and onion shoots sharp enough to bring tears. Eliza divided each harvest into 3 parts. Eat, regrow, trade if trade ever came. Trade came wearing frost in his beard. His name was Orrin Bell, a freight driver who knew every bad road between Carson and the northern camps. A whiteout caught him with 1 mule, half a sack of salt, and no sense of direction left. He saw smoke breathing from a snowbank and dug toward it, expecting a hunter's fire or a ghost. He found Eliza Harrow standing with a slate knife in her hand. Behind her, Caleb held a burning branch like a sword. Orrin took in the hearth, the water basin, the stacked wood, the hair pelts, the clay shelves, and then the impossible patch of green glowing at the back of the cave. He removed his hat, not for politeness, for evidence. "I heard they ran you out," he said. "They did. I heard you were mad." Eliza looked at the garden, not in any profitable way. Orrin laughed, then coughed until he bent double. She let him stay 3 days. He repaired her snare knots, showed Caleb how to read mule tracks under drifted snow, and taught them to smoke meat in the entrance where the chimney pulled just enough. In return, Eliza fed him broth green with cress and sent him away with a bundle of turnip tops wrapped in cloth. He left her the salt. "Payment," he said. The word changed the cave. Before Orrin, Eliza and Caleb had been surviving outside the town's permission. After Orrin, the cave became a place with value Gideon could not price in advance. Orrin reached Black Pine with the greens tucked under his coat. Gideon Vale saw them first at the company counter and accused him of stealing from a cellar. Orrin placed one onion shoot on the scale. "Cellars do not grow sunlight," he said. There were witnesses. The doctor's wife was one of them. Her name was Clara Mott, and her youngest boy had a cough that had turned wet and deep. Clara had already boiled pine needles, rubbed goose grease on his chest, and prayed until prayer began to feel like repeating a debt nobody intended to pay. When she saw fresh green in Orrin's hand, she did not care whether it came from witchcraft, weather sense, or the underside of the world. She came to the ravine 2 days later with quinine, wool socks, and a sack of flour. Eliza met her at the cave mouth. For a moment, they were only two women measuring the cost of pride. Clara said, "My boy needs food that is alive." Eliza nodded. No apology was offered. None was required for the trade to be real. She filled Clara's basket with cress, onion shoots, and the smallest turnips. Clara left the flour on a flat stone and touched the cave wall with one hand as if confirming the heat for herself. After that, people came quietly. A farmer with bacon wrapped in cloth, a blacksmith with a repaired pot and 3 iron hooks, a girl carrying a cracked mirror from her mother's trunk, an old woman with jars. They did not arrive as believers. Belief was too expensive. They arrived as people whose children were hungry and whose cupboards were losing the argument. Eliza did not ask them to say she had been right. Rightness had become too small a prize. She weighed greens against flour, herbs against lamp oil, seed against wool. She taught those who listened how to pack snow around root stores, how to read animal movement without turning it into superstition, how to angle a mirror so weak light became useful. Every trade widened the hidden season. Meanwhile, Black Pine's official winter collapsed. Gideon's shelves thinned first at the edges. Salt pork gone, beans rationed, flour sold by the cup. Men who had mocked early cutting now dug frozen hay from fields with hatchets. Roofs sagged under snow because nobody had reinforced them in time. Then came the sickness. It began as tiredness people blamed on cold. Then bruises bloomed on skin that had not been struck. Gums bled, old wounds opened. Children cried when they chewed. The doctor said the word quietly because old words can frighten a room more than new ones. Scurvy, a disease of absence. The cure was fresh food, and the only fresh food in 50 miles was growing under the mountain, with the woman Black Pine had thrown away. In February, Gideon Vale came to the ravine. Reverend Pike came with him, though the Reverend stayed half a step behind, where shame could pretend to be dignity. Gideon no longer looked like a man weather obeyed. His beard had gone rough, his eyes sat deep in his face. Snow had wet the hems of his good trousers until they froze stiff. Eliza was trimming cabbage leaves when his shadow crossed the entrance. Caleb, taller now in the way children become taller during hardship, stood beside the hearth and said nothing.
Gideon looked past Eliza at the garden.
The tin reflectors flashed pale light over rows of green. Steam breathed from the stone seam. Bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling. Jars stood on shelves cut into clay. The place he had expected to be a widow's den was a working world, a better organized world than his own. Reverend Pike spoke first. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. "There are children ill." Gideon swallowed. "Dr. Mott says they need greens." Eliza kept the knife in her hand. "How many?" The question struck him harder than accusation would have. He had prepared for rage. He had prepared for refusal. He had perhaps even prepared for forgiveness, because men like Gideon often imagine forgiveness as a stage built for their humiliation. He had not prepared for logistics. 9 children, he said, and more adults. Eliza turned to Caleb. "The long baskets," she said. "Line them with damp cloth." They cut the garden hard that afternoon. Cress, cabbage leaves, onion shoots, turnip greens, the bitter herbs that stirred blood and appetite. Eliza worked quickly, with the clean mercy of someone who knew delay was another form of cruelty. Gideon watched her hands, those hands he had ordered out of town. Those hands had built soil where there should have been stone, light where there should have been dark, and harvest where every official voice had promised nothing was wrong. When the baskets were full, he reached inside his coat. Eliza stiffened, but what he brought out was not money. It was Nathan's field journal.
The leather was cracked. The corners were dark with handling. Eliza knew it before he held it fully into the light.
"I found it in the company trunk," Gideon said. A lie, but not the largest lie he had ever told. He held it out. His hand shook. "I should have returned it." That was as close as he could come. Eliza took the journal. For a moment, her thumb rested on the place where Nathan had once pressed a pencil too hard and left a dent in the cover. She could have made Gideon name what he had done. She could have asked Reverend Pike whether fear was still a poor lantern. She could have made the whole cave listen to her victory. Instead, she placed the journal on the shelf above the warm seam and lifted one of the baskets. "The ravine trail will ice over by dark," she said.
"Take the lower creek. It is longer, but the wind cannot cut so deep there."
Gideon nodded once. Not forgiven, directed. There is a difference. The greens did not save everyone. Stories lie when they pretend one basket can undo a winter. But the greens saved enough. Clara Mott's boy kept his teeth. The Miller twins stopped bleeding from the gums. Men who had been too weak to stand began walking from bed to stove and back again. Soup pots in black pine turned green at the surface, and every spoonful carried a truth no sermon could boil away. The woman who had been cast out for reading the winter had read it correctly. More than that, she had built an answer. When the thaw finally came, the town expected Eliza to return. Gideon even sent word that the lean-to behind the assay shed could be repaired. Eliza laughed when Orrin told her, not bitterly, briefly, as if he had offered to trade a house for a hole in the roof. She stayed with the warm stone. Spring opened the ravine in stages. Snow shrank from the pines. Water ran louder. The cave mouth emerged, black and ordinary to anyone who did not know what waited inside. Caleb built a door from cedar poles and scrap iron. Orrin brought a goat. Clara brought jars. The blacksmith set proper hinges and refused payment until Eliza forced 3 bundles of greens into his arms. By the second winter, the back chamber had doubled. By the fifth, there were 4 growing rooms, each following a different seam of warmth. One held roots, one held greens, one held seed trays, one stayed damp enough for mushrooms, which Caleb discovered by accident, and Eliza turned into a crop by refusing to ignore them.
People began calling it Harrow Garden.
Not the cave, not the widow's place, the garden. Children from Black Pine were sent there to learn how to observe without being ashamed of it. Eliza made them sit for an hour before touching a tool. She asked what they heard, what they smelled, where the frost held longest, which leaves bent toward light, which stones gathered damp. Most wanted rules. She gave them attention. Rules are what you write after the world has taught you something, she said. Gideon Vale never became a good man in the way stories sometimes require. He remained careful with money. He remained proud. He still liked to hear his own name spoken with respect. But he never again set a planting date without sending someone to ask Eliza what the animals were doing.
That was not redemption. It was evidence.
Reverend Pike changed more quietly. One autumn, he preached that God might speak through signs too small for arrogant men to honor. He did not say Eliza's name. He did not have to. Everyone in the church heard it anyway. Eliza lived 31 more years in the ravine. She did not grow rich. Rich was not the shape of her victory. She grew useful in a way nobody could take back. Her ledger books filled a shelf, then a trunk, then 3 trunks. Frost dates, seed trials, soil mixtures, storm patterns, failures, corrections, stubborn questions. When the great white winter struck the territory years later and wagons froze in place on the road, Harrow Garden fed Black Pine and 2 smaller camps through 11 weeks of blocked passes. The Newtown clerk, who had been one of the children Eliza taught to watch frost, recorded the numbers plainly. 217 people received food from the ravine. No miracle was entered in the ledger. Only cabbage, cress, turnip, onion, mushroom, bean, and the tonnage of hay cut early because Eliza had read the elk trails in September. She died in April, sitting near the first bed she had planted. Caleb, grown broad-shouldered and gray at the temples, had placed her chair where the reflected sun crossed the soil at noon. Her hands rested on a bowl of seeds. The warm seam breathed behind her. From the lower chamber came the sound of grandchildren arguing over who had watered the beans too much. Her face held no triumph. Triumph belongs to people still trying to be seen. Eliza Harrow had been seen by the mountain, by the weather, by the green things that answered when she gave them what they needed. Caleb buried her at the ravine mouth, under the pines that had hidden the entrance the first winter. He carved her marker from limestone and set the little brown stone into it, the one that had led her there. By then, it was no longer warm. It did not need to be. The inscription was 6 words. She listened before the world did. And that is the part people remembered when the story traveled beyond Black Pine Crossing. Not that a widow found a warm cave, not that a town was humbled, not even that children were saved by greens grown in the dark. They remembered that everyone had access to the signs. The birds had left for everyone. The creek had frozen for everyone. The animals had moved for everyone. The stone had warmed in a country where every other stone was cold. But only one person was poor enough, lonely enough, wounded enough, and honest enough to keep noticing after powerful men told her not to. Some truths do not arrive with thunder. They arrive as a small warmth in your palm. Quiet, unexplained, easy to dismiss. The question is whether you throw it away because nobody important recognizes it, or whether you follow it into the dark and learn what can grow there.